So after all of those plenaries, breakouts, we've got our final plenary, but that's hopefully going to be the most exciting, where we bring everything back together. So thank you for your cooperation throughout this time. Please keep the energy levels the same. I would just like to start off with, you must have noticed, we're a big fan of evaluation and getting your feedback, trying to understand your point of view. So we've left out some feedback forms on your table. It'd be great if you could let us know what you thought. They're very simple answers, nothing complicated. Feel free to put down what you want over there, and we'll definitely collect them back, and we'll have a big discussion on that bit. So that's that. The second bit that I wanted to talk about is very exciting. So if you remember, we did promise that anybody who named their inspiration maths, dropped it in, we would have a lucky draw. I didn't say lucky draw, we would have a draw, and there's a lucky winner, and we actually have this winner. So it literally says the winner of the year subscription to Enterprise Development and Microfinance Journal is, can we get some drum rolls? Ooh, this is exciting. And I'm really sorry if I get the name pronunciation wrong, but Mike, would you like to say it?
I'll go for Wadilav Sansole.
You have to, woo! That's great. That's our winner of an annual subscription to the EDM Journal. You do not get the journal right now, but we will send you the details via email. Honest.
Thank you.
You can hold us to that. You can hold us to that. We will do that. Fab. So that's what we have. And just to remind you, all the conference delegates are getting access to the online version of the same thing. So if you didn't pick up a leaflet already, please pick that up. And you have a subscription to it till 30th June. I'm now going to hand over to Mike to do a wonderful wrap-up.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So here we are, end of the second day. It seems to have gone very, very fast. But I want to take you back to the little speech I gave on yesterday morning. And I wrapped up at the end of that with raising what I saw as three big issues that our keynote speakers had raised. And I brought a panel back, including Patricia, who was one of the keynote speakers, back to kind of re-examine those questions in the light of what we've learned or insights we've had or wisdom we've gained from connections we've made over the last 2 days. So this will be quite quick. It's going to be quite interactive. Don't worry. We're going to wrap up in an hour. I really would appreciate your attention and thoughtfulness for this last hour, because we want to really make the most out of what we've been doing for the last 2 days. And this is my last opportunity to tap you for your collective wisdom and experience. So let me start by addressing the first of those three questions, which was the one about evidence. And we had a very, I thought, an extremely interesting and informative plenary this morning. What I'm not going to ask these four wise folk to do is to recap or go over those arguments or discussions again. But I am interested in how we take this challenge of evidence, or the paucity of evidence was what Patricia referred to. How do we take that forward in a constructive way? And I'm going to ask Patricia to come up and just give us her thoughts based on what she's heard over the last 2 days. Would you mind standing up?
Okay.
Thank you.
Your question about going forward, but before that, I wanted to pick up a question that somebody put very succinctly late last night. How much evidence is enough to convince our donors? And I've been thinking about that, and I've got two responses which kind of go in different directions. So bear with me. But my first slightly facetious response is enough so that we can manage our portfolio of interventions. Yeah, so we talked quite a lot about, the fact that some of them fail, some of them work, that as long as the ones that work well enough pay out big enough, they cover the losses for the ones that we have to kill off early. So, and that's the kind of approach that we need to take to managing our own development portfolio. We're interested in managing maximising development outcomes from our aid budget across a range of approaches. And I think that within our portfolio of market systems programs, you know, we need to be taking a kind of portfolio approach and you know, be confident that across our portfolio, the big wins are paying
so
out.
it's a collective challenge for us as a field.
Yeah, yeah. So that's my sort of slightly facetious one, you know, so we can manage our portfolio. But actually my more serious response is, I don't think it's really about volume, actually. It's not really quite about how much. It's about what evidence and about the quality of the evidence. I think that's actually a bigger issue at the moment than volume. And I found the session this morning really helpful in kind of illuminating some of those issues. And I really liked the way I think Nicholas talked about the 3 types of evidence, sort of for knowledge, for decision making, and for accountability. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that there's a lot of good practice in using evidence in market systems approaches. You know, we're an evidence-friendly and evidence-hungry kind of field. So we do it all the time in problem analysis and in internal program, or at least I think we do it all the time in internal program flexible and adaptable management. And there's a lot of really good practice in results measurement and monitoring using the DCED standard. So, you know, whilst we might be talking about a paucity of evidence, I think it's in quite a narrow bit of the evidence spectrum where we have a problem. And actually, having been here, that's a little bit more positive than I recognised. So I was in, one of the things I talked about was hard evidence of value for money. And then I went along to Peter's presentation, and you know, and he presented it really clearly on CAVAC, what the successes had generated in terms of incomes and what the program had cost. Really hard value for money evidence, which I hadn't come across before. And I've also heard about evaluations underway, including for DFID programs. So I think there's more evidence coming, and I think that's great. So going forward, what else can we do? I think my first response is, I think being a bit more systematic about it. It feels like we've been, even within DFID, a bit ad hoc about, you know, when and what are we commissioning an independent impact evaluation on. So I think being a bit more systematic about the body of evaluation evidence, and the review that we saw today was helpful. It identified that there were 8 or 9 impact evaluations out there. So I think the next thing will be to try and, you know, be a bit more systematic about what are the gaps in the impact evaluation, and this is something BEAM can certainly help with. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to look at gaps kind of along the theory of change. So I'm fairly comfortable now that we've proven, if you like, we've demonstrated that we can facilitate market actors to deliver things which we previously might have thought we had to deliver. So I'm pretty convinced that through all the case studies, we've demonstrated that we can successfully intervene to change the behaviour of a market actor. At the intervention level, I'm comfortable. At the systemic change level, I'm a bit less comfortable, and at the impact level, I'm a bit less comfortable. And I see that we're sort of we're going to different lengths along the theory of change. In different log frames and in different programs. So sometimes we're going all the way to the farmer's income, but sometimes we're not, you know. So I think, you know, mapping the evidence and the gaps along the theory of change. I think looking at gaps in evaluation methods, because I think when I talked to Elizabeth about what makes a body of evidence, I think different methods and looking at it from different perspectives and triangulating would be important. And then also looking at gaps across the sectors, because it was very clear from the presentation earlier that a lot of the documents that they identified were agriculture. Unsurprising, but we're now doing a lot more beyond agriculture. So helping us be more systematic about identifying the gaps and then working with us to fill them. And I think a second way forward is sort of highlighting the good examples of where we're using evidence and where we're collecting evidence. So highlighting for us the good examples of log frames, those which are going to different lengths of the theory of change, good examples of where learning loops are being used and where the data for learning, not just for log frames, is being collected, and good examples of the side-by-side evaluations that we were hearing about earlier, and how tricky they are, but how useful and important.
Okay, thank you very much. Augustine, I know you have a few thoughts on this issue too. Can you enlighten us?
Yes, I do, Mike. But not such a long time ago, which is just simply to say to you that I'm not so ancient. A mentor told me that when you are the last to speak, or among the last to speak, make sure you don't repeat anything that has already been said. If you have to, say it in your own words or say it in different words. Here I am. Everything has been said. All the words have been used. Paucity of evidence or paucity of English words. So I'm tempted to do what James said team leaders should do. Learn to speak in tongues. Anyway, I have 3 key themes that I would have loved to share with you. One is the distinction between the need for evidence and the evidence needed. We tend to confuse the two. There is no dispute. I haven't heard any contestation amongst any of us about the need for evidence. What is being debated heavily is what type of evidence is needed. I'm going to do the clever thing, which is, because I don't have that much time to do, I'm going to skirt around these issues and hope that you direct all your questions back to me, not to them, so I can have more time to discuss these themes with you. The second theme, which I would like rather to spend a little bit of time on now, if Mike would give me that time, is the moral dimension of evidence. We all tend to think of evidence, at least with respect to accountability, with regard to the donor. Or in the case of Patricia and David, those I prefer to see as my clients. What about the beneficiary? What about the poor, smallholder farmer? And I say this to my team every single day. The business person who is helping the poor farmer to have access to gain a little bit more income, when they invest and something goes wrong, they have what it takes to bounce back. When the poor person invests and something goes wrong, she is wiped out. So who do we owe accountability to? I want to be sure that what I'm asking that poor smallholder farmer to invest in, there is evidence, not that it works, but of the likelihood of it working. And my team will ask me, but what is the poor farmer investing? I say, I don't care. His expectations alone are sufficient investment that require a return. So I do account to David, and I have my principles here, and I say that is ticking the boxes. What I'm more concerned about is accounting to those who I hold David's money in trust for. I am a trustee, and if we don't develop the self-discipline as trustees, and we think all that matters is proving just to ourselves and to our clients that this works, we'll get caught up in that moral dilemma. But in the corporate world, we say morality doesn't count that much. I was taught a couple of years ago that in the marketplace, there is no temple of morality. But we are not, strictly speaking. As MSD, we use the MSD, but we are development practitioners. So let's pay a little more attention to the evidence that we need to help bring those for whom we are all gathered here like to believe. Give them sufficient evidence that their investment would yield a good return. If you don't have that evidence, please don't bother their lives. I'll come back.
Thank you very much, Augustine. Now, what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to throw this same question to all of you. I'm particularly interested in what you think the Beam Exchange could or should do in relation to these challenges around evidence. We don't ask us to do what you as program managers or you as suppliers should do. We have a particular function in this market to support this field. So have a think about what you think an appropriate role for the Beam Exchange is in relation to evidence. And what I'm going to ask you to do is discuss that amongst yourselves in reasonably small groups, 3 or 4 people, so you can hear each other talk for 5 minutes. And then, as we did yesterday, I'm going to send a few of my roving colleagues around the room to get your feedback. And I need you to write down your answers because we won't have time to feed them all back verbally, but I am very interested to know what you think. So if you can, try and write down a few things as well as discussing them. Is that clear? Okay, 5 minutes to talk amongst yourselves in reasonably small groups.
We think we should be commissioning some research that resets donor expectations. It's research-based, some studies which we do using ourselves as a laboratory to begin to explore what works, what doesn't, meta-evaluations, so tying things together, because none of us can actually afford to be able to do that on our own. Secondly, the studies that would come out of this should be able to then shape investment expectations and should be able to guide and steer where donors should then be able to put their money safely with the expectation of result.
Thank you.
Kevin Conroy from Enable, Nigeria. There's nothing like preaching to the converted. We're all here today. I think we need to be honest with ourselves and say it only takes one bad egg to actually ruin faith in the system. I see Beam's role is when I gather evidence and my team work together to make cases for systems change, we feed that up to our DFID officer in Nigeria, and they probably feed it to their head of office. I see Beam, Springfield, maybe Adam Smith International's role is to try and get to that other level, you know, the head of West Africa or even more senior than that, to influence them and filter out the really good pieces of evidence and be that filter that can say this is a strong piece of work that's been done and influence at that level. And I think that will do a lot to basically enhance the buy-in at that level. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any more? Would it be all right if you stood up?
Okay, now it works. Okay, just one point from this table. We mentioned that it will be good for Beam to address approaches that are alternatives to value for money that DFID and USAID would want. For instance, as it regards to social projects, because there are social projects that you can't quantify in value for money analysis. That would be good for Beam to address those.
Okay, thank you.
You're going to hold the mic, eh? Am I not trustworthy, Sean? No, I want to be able to answer it. Indeed. Yeah. He knows me too well, you see. He knows me too well. End of a conference. Say something different, Augustine. The discussion we had here was evidence for what? Evidence answers questions. And we talked briefly in the debate earlier about demand side. Well, demand side asks questions. and we're not asking the right questions, questions which are exact and tangible. And this is what DFID and other donors and other funders need to do. It's no good saying more evidence. It's no good talking about the types of evidence. You have to shape and frame specific questions to which programs can respond. So on this table, thinking about BEAM and its resources and its structure, and donors need to do better at clarifying the exact and tangible questions they seek answers to, which BEAM can help generate in partnership with them and communicate to us, the field of practice, and coordinate back our evidence responses. And that has implications on dialogue platforms, the right people involved in those, and a recurrent process. Because evidence goes into an ever-shifting political economy which never stays still. So the evidence we present today and win the battles today will be irrelevant tomorrow. So we have to keep doing this, and BEAM need to work with DFID, and DFID need to work recurrently to ask the right questions that we can answer. And that's not happening.
Thank you. One at the back there.
Yeah, actually, we had the hub before and it didn't really work out. But now I think Mike and Ashley and others in your team, I actually think you do a fantastic job. You ask around for years or so, you're always asking what should we do, what is our exact role we should play. Also here, I think you did a very good seminar here. So just follow what you have been doing so far. You're doing a great job. Except the coffee was not very good.
Thank you, Peter. I'll get you that beer later. One last question here. What feedback here?
Okay. I think we need to ask what we need evidence for. I'd like to make 2 points. We need really 2 broad types of evidence. They overlap, but they have a different function. We have a function for project control, accountability, including accountability to the beneficiary, I agree. But essentially, it's within the project, you're trying to find out what results you've got, what results you may have got, how you build capacity around the process of learning what you've achieved and what you've not achieved. It's all about the project and therefore your portfolio of projects. There's another type of evidence which is sadly lacking. That I agree with Patricia, probably the first evidence we're making progress on. There are gaps, but we're making progress. But the second evidence is that the killer, the one that shows you what the Green Revolution, that shows you your mass immunization program, that transforms and says you are able to show that you have transformed the whole sectors and whole regions by MSD. And that can, although it builds on the systemic change which is developed by projects within their own capacities, it's far beyond the capacity of any project to do. First of all, it's too long term, and secondly, of course, you need to have experience from many, many countries. And so that, to me, and to my colleagues from SDC here, appears to be the main, a good role for me to stimulate this kind of initiative, which must be done by research. It cannot be done within projects. You can use the results of projects, but go further.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay. All of those bits of advice are being noted, and anything else that you write down for us to and leave for us to pick up off the table will also be noted. So thank you for that. I'd like to move on to the second topic now of the 3 that I started with yesterday morning. The second topic has been referred to in various ways. Jim talked about a mismatch of incentives between what, if you like, we would ideally like to be able to do as practitioners and what donors, and in particular the bureaucracy of the aid industry, is able to accommodate. We talked about the political economy of aid. I'm going to refer to it as moving the goalposts. In other words, what are we being asked to do as a field, and what would we like to do, and are they aligned? And I think we all recognise that the goalposts are never going to be exactly where we want them to be. We're always going to be juggling that. But I would like to know, rather than complaining about that all the time and saying how difficult it is to work within this bureaucratic architecture that we have to work within, I think what's really interesting is to think about what we can do constructively to manage that situation, to manage the operating environment that we are inevitably working within. And I'm going to ask Helen to tell us what she thinks about that. Have you got a microphone?
I do.
Excellent.
You called this moving the goalposts, yeah?
Yeah.
I thought I was going last, so I wasn't even listening. But no, right, so it's a good example.
I moved the goalpost.
Yeah, you did. He's actually been moving them a lot, I'd like to tell you, from yesterday evening. All right, just going to keep this very, very short and sweet. So my job as team leader is to create the optimum space to allow the program to flourish and interventions to work. That's what I do. I work hard to make that happen and to allow the team to be able to operate properly, to have the mechanisms that work to allow me to do that. So, you know, that's my main role, and sometimes I've had to fight like a lion, and other times I can relax a bit because things are going well. And I think that's okay. I expect to do that as part of my job. For me, a lot of the talks we've had here at the conference have come from a very high level. You know, we sort of talk at the policy level. We're all, you know, boiling away with our ideas together, you know, getting very hot and heavy about it. But we're talking from a very, the practical side of implementers and how we feel in the field. But as any of us that implement things practically know, that the real, you know, you've got to think about the interface of where things actually get done. And in this relationship between the donor and the implementing partner, we have to think about the interface in the country between the team leader maybe or other program staff and between the national program office. That's the actual interface where the communication takes place, most of it. So being aware of that, we need to just think clearly about making that communication across that interface as clear as possible. And also within it being aware that we have to navigate it and facilitate. I just apply facilitation techniques, frankly, with the local office. And in the past there have been difficulties and misunderstandings and things like when my spending was going to be controlled to $500, after which I would have to ask for authority, and I was allowed a maximum of 10, which would have, killed the program, needless to say. So then I fought hard. But in other ways, I tried to give as much as possible, you know, to turn the relationship into a positive one. So so reframing that sort of communication space. One example, for example, was when I came in, SDC funds my program. Governance was the absolute thing that year. It was the 5 principles of good governance, and we had a big workshop on it, and you know, it was really, really very sincerely being put across that these 5 principles should be in the program and really worked. And I could see there was a kind of pain on the, the donor side there. They really needed this in their programs. And I was about to write the sort of main proposal, so I thought, okay, they've tried really hard, very earnestly, so I'll do it. I'll put them in. And put them in quite seriously and thought about an outcome. I thought, well, yeah, it's not just talk, it's actually really useful stuff. Similarly with gender. Gender for me was an easy win. I want a gender equitable program. I want my women and men of the target group to benefit. And SDC were very strong on gender. They got a really good gender framework. We'd had some bad experiences. We'd been slapped over the head a few times by people coming out and saying strange things that we couldn't really respond to. politely. But anyway, I thought, no, this is something I believe in. Let's make this work. Now, the local program officer, who is a civil servant, who stays in their job, whose boss changes every 3 or 4 years. They're not sure really what their orientation is. Are they sort of pro-M4P, or are they a major governance person, or are they a macroeconomic person? And they have to weather the winds of change. They live there. It's their job. It's their life. So what I'm trying to say is the local office is subject to all the cultural constraints of their environment. You've got to think about that when you're dealing with them. So in giving, a good piece of governance writing and some activities and some things for them to report back to their boss and their HQ, they were really happy. And so that's just one example. The second one, and last one, sort of trade-off. We had a lot of problems with visibility. We negotiated hard. The very first phase of the program was backstopped by Springfield, and the visibility issue was very high on the agenda then. I haven't really heard it discussed here this time. So it must be, maybe it's just accepted that that's the way to do it. But
sorry, just explain what
visibility,
what
so
visibility.
Low visibility, maintaining low visibility on your program interventions in the market, not sticking stickers on everything and, proclaiming everything with 100 signs. So anyway, we fought very hard for that. Springfield fought very hard for that. And we negotiated a contract with the local office, which was that if a Mercy Corps logo went on it and the Progro logo went on it, then we'd have to put SDC on as well. But in general, we got it through. We've had to push back quite a few times, but in general, it's been okay. And for me, the main thing to work is to say, donor, I will give you high visibility, very, very high. But I'll give it in the external operating environment of the program. I will talk about how brilliant you are, because I think you are brilliant in many ways, in the Beam Exchange conference, in the DCD conference, in external publications. I will quite openly talk about those things and what I think is good and so on. But within the market interventions, within the operating space, where it will cause damage, no. So that was the sort of trade-off, and then bringing to the attention of the donor and the office things like, where successes have been had, documentary films, very highly visible things that can then be shared around the donor organization they can use for their own benefit. So those are, I'll be quiet now, those are just a few examples.
Thank you, Helen. I took you at your word. That you wouldn't speak for very long, that is. Now, this question is one that I know a couple of the other panelists also want to speak on, so I want to ask Augustine again, if you don't mind. Where am I? Where are you? Yeah, great. Please tell us, you had some thoughts on this, didn't you?
Know why he found it difficult finding me? Those of you who are very, very observant may have noticed that I've changed the way I dressed in the morning. I wore a jacket, and I had a blue and black striped shirt. Now, those of you who are very, very perceptive would realize I've actually dressed down. I was trying to hide from him. Anyway, Jim, if you did not already have a PhD, I would have asked you to go back and do research on speaking in tongues, and you'd get a brilliant PhD. Because as a team leader, you pointed out, now I'm going to speak about political economy, but as a marketing strategist. Because we have to do that. We have to engage our clients, and I insist on referring to DFID as a client. I insist on referring to all donors as my clients, as my customers. So I research their needs, and they do have needs. If even those needs are just simply, and please forgive me, just to keep their jobs. That's a serious need. It's an existential need, isn't it? I need to understand that. When we were going through rehearsing this yesterday, Mike said in passing, maybe you need to be a Donald Trump. And I said, seriously, we all have to become Donald Trumps. We have to know what they want us to tell them, and we tell them what they want us to tell them, and they'll clap hands for us and give us more money. But more seriously, we need to carry out some level of communication engagement. And you cannot communicate effectively if you don't segment your customers. If you don't understand that what Patricia wants to hear may be different from what Bill wants to hear, and may also be slightly different from what Mike wants to hear. The message may be the same that you want to deliver to all three, but then you position that message differently. We actually, as team leaders and as implementers, more generally speaking, are comfortable saying, leave us to do our job. Jim reminded us our job is not ended when we get into the trenches or out of the trenches. Communication is a strong part of that job, and we should take it more seriously. Political economy, if you do the analysis, the purpose is normally to understand who is on your side, who is resisting. No, that's not the purpose. The purpose is to understand how you can move who is resisting onto your side, how you can use those who are already on your side to strengthen your case, your cause. So in everything that we do, I'm just going to come back to the main point that this, for me, this whole conference has been about: evidence. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's only fair, Patricia, to give you another no. In that case, I'm going to throw it back out to you. The same question here. Not recap the whole argument. I just want to know what you think the Beam Exchange can do in this space around these issues. How can we support the moving of the goalposts into a more conducive place? So I'm going to give you 5 minutes to talk about that and come up with a few ideas. Thank you.
So my impression at the moment is that a lot of the information you're doing is, or the information you're producing is being seen by people who support the approach and maybe want to learn how to do it better, which is great. But I think in terms of people who may be much more skeptical about the approach, I think Beam could possibly do more to be trying to go out to them, persuade them, find out why they're skeptical, see what else Beam can do to address that skepticism.
Great, thank you. Any other volunteers? My facilitators are. Well, that's fine. You don't. I mean, if no one wants to volunteer something, you want to write it down instead. Collins.
Sorry, this might.
Go on.
Okay, this might be totally out of the blue. Okay. I think I want to tie this into what was talked about moving goalposts, and then link it to the earlier question on evidence. I think the reason why there is there is movement of goalposts is because there is no clear standard against which the evidence is set. So, my suggestion is that Beam Exchange could actually develop some way that there is a standard that you can actually say this type of evidence actually is what we need to be looking for, so that the donor does not have to move, they go with that type of evidence. So, is there a mechanism that Beam Exchange could use to move us towards that body of evidence that has integrity, that has another English word I can't remember?
Okay.
Just
Thank
to
you.
add a final word,
Yeah.
I remember earlier on in the morning, I did mention something to do with the kind of evidence currently we are collecting is meant for the client. And believe me, if you are coming to collect evidence for the client, I'll show the best picture. Because it is about them assessing me. But if evidence collection is based on a participatory, collaborative arrangement where we own the results together, we share the blame together, we celebrate the success together, then that evidence will be better and more informative. Thank you.
Thank you, Collins. Okay, I'm going to rush us on to the third question that I brought up yesterday morning, which was about bottlenecks in implementation, essentially about the human resource constraints we face as a field. And I think someone summed it up, Jim perhaps in his speech, as, you know, are market facilitators born or bred? And we've got one final thoughts on that from the panel here, which is Bill Grant.
Well, I really get the graveyard shift. I mean, it's 5:30. We are supposed to have been finished. Everybody else has gone over. I've got somebody in the back threatening to hold up a red card after 3 minutes. So we'll give it a shot. Born or bred? I mean, it's an interesting question. And I don't think there's one, it's not an all or nothing. I think that there are it's a combination. I do have perhaps one of the fairly unique slots here in that I've been involved in this general approach. We'll start with the systemic development. The first major movement and first major effort on systemic development really kind of started with the Gemini project and the subsector approach. How many people here know what the Gemini project was? How many people here have seen the Thai silk video? Boy, it's even fewer. David, that means not many of them went to the Springfield trainings from between 2000 and 2006. But Gemini was introducing a new concept, which was systemic development, and there was a paucity of good people to do the work. It was designed by PhD ag economists coming out of Michigan State and a bunch of MBAs. And it was really, an innovative way to look at poverty and where are the microenterprises and how do we get the whole system involved and how do we make the thing grow. And there weren't very many people. Well, there have been waves of these movements. Gemini moved into it had financial services and it had BDS. And the BDS lagged behind because it was more complicated. Financial services, when there's money involved, things get solved more quickly. BDS was not quite as simple. But the BDS then evolved into what we now really have as market systems development, which had two parallel approaches. You had the M4P, which was heavily influenced by Springfield and their BDS work. And we also had the value chain approach, which came out of USAID. And on both sides, there have been a shortage of good analysts. And so I guess one of the questions is, and then things were kind of limping along and it wasn't a major problem, except that, well, when we first introduced Gemini, there weren't enough people. So Gemini designed a training course. And they had the Thai silk video. They made a video and it really broke down the whole process. And there may have been 500 or 1,000 people trained in how to do subsector analysis. But actually very little of that stuck. Maybe 50 people really latched onto it and it really worked. And that was okay because that's kind of where there wasn't that much demand. As market systems development has really taken off, I'd say since about 2008, there have been a number of us who have been doing this since the 90s and early 2000s, and we were able to keep pace through BSMDP and the beginning of Catalyst. But about 2008, 2009, all of a sudden there were dozens of projects appearing. And in 2012, DFID led, I think, 15 market systems development projects around the world. There just wasn't enough demand. And who's out there training? Who was out there building capacity? It was, Springfield was kind of it. But what I'd like to say is, those people who designed the systemic approaches in the beginning were the innovators, and they were not bred. Nobody had trained them in the methodology. They were the ones who developed the methodology. And I'd like to say, well, I'm not an innovator. I'm one of the early adopters. I saw something that was interesting, and I jumped on board and have been an advocate and a promoter. And I see my job as really, how do I convince, the early majority to get on board? And I think we're in terms of, capacity building, we have, our sector is constantly evolving. It has moved from subsector to market system development, but even market systems development has changed quite a bit. Or just the introduction of the word systems. It was market development as of 2013. Now it's market systems development. But as we do this, we have the issue of we need different sets of skills. It's not just analysts. It's not subsector analysts. It is, we need some good analysts, but we need a lot of good implementers. And they actually have different skill sets and different requirements. We need good MRM people. We need DCED auditors. There's a whole range of skills that are needed to actually make this complex set of projects work. And, how do we make this happen? The emphasis has always been on training. I think training is good, training is useful, but as we learned with Gemini, and as, how many people have been through the Springfield training courses, and how many of them can actually use and apply what they've learned? It's how do we do the follow-up, the mentorship, the continued pushing of people to say, that's good, but did you think about this? Pushing them, making them think through it. And what is interesting is I'm seeing now there's quite a few people coming on board with training programs for market systems development. The Pollen Group has just introduced one. I think SEEP has something going. We still have Springfield, but there are more and more people who are introducing because they see a demand for this. And I think it is gradually going to hit the scale that we need to get to the tipping point and lead to a systemic change in the supply of people. But it's a market demand. There was no demand 5 years ago. There was very little training. There was very little capacity building. I think it's happening now. Whose responsibility is it? Who should be paying for it? And I think this is something that, everybody's pointing, the donor should pay for it, the company should pay for it, the people should pay for it, because the training actually benefits the person, but it benefits the company. It also benefits the donor. And so I just want to be thinking about who should be paying for it. Once people are trained, they're in the system. And if they work for DAI or they work for ASI or they move from one company to the other, we're all still in the system. And I think that's the important thing, is that as we develop and we move around, perhaps a company might do better or do worse, but the system will always do better. So there's a real incentive for everybody here, if we believe in what we're doing, to really promote training, but not just training, but to promote mentorship and applying what we're teaching people. Thanks.
Thank you, Bill.
Mike. So Bill, would it be fair to say that, that you would recommend as a follow-up or a next steps that BEAM should have a market systems development approach to the market system for capacity building market systems practitioners?
Actually, that is a practical intervention. And Deborah and I were discussing this before when I said this, and she said, oh, but there's a really interesting thing happening. There's somebody who's put an online DCED training course, and 30 people have each paid £300 each to participate, and 10 of them actually paid with their own money. So it is happening. If there's a demand, market systems, people will offer the service, but it's a question of how expensive is it? Who should pay for it? Who does, who pays?
Well, by the way, I'm not going to throw this topic back out to you all now so you can relax. Part of the reason I'm not going to throw it back out to you is because actually BEAM has already got a working group of some quite distinguished people who know this subject matter and have struggled with it for a while working on this. And we commissioned a study which has done a lot of interviews with all actors within the market, applying exactly what you're talking about, a market systems framework to the process of building a market for the training in. So that study is in draft form. It's back with the working group at the moment for final revisions, and will then be published by the Beam Exchange very soon. So I hope we will have some answers to share with you about what what we think the way to catalyze this, develop this market is. So thank you for thanks for queuing that up. Okay. So I'm just going to wrap up now this debate. Thank you very much to the 4 panelists who I think have been very engaging, and despite the fact that it's late on a Friday afternoon, and we probably all would like to get to the bar as soon as possible. How do I wrap this up quickly? Look, we're a maturing field. There's more people involved. There's more material. There's more projects. We may be sometimes asking the same questions that we were asking 10 years ago, but we're asking them in a much more refined and sophisticated way than we were 10 years ago. So I think, there's a lot of reason to be optimistic and a lot of reason to feel satisfied that we are making progress. At the same time, I can't help wondering sometimes whether, as the inevitable kind of movement of the aid industry into the next paradigm happens, that there's a danger that, market systems approaches begins to sort of seem to feel like it's losing its relevancy. I think it's worth remembering that donors, bless their cotton socks, are not the only people that matter. And actually, although of course for a lot of us depend on getting donor contracts to stay in a job, there are other people using these tools and methods and thinking. And if you think back 15 years to when the Blue Book for BDS was published, nobody talks about that. Introduced a whole new way of thinking about development to a lot of people. Not direct delivery, facilitation. It was a radical set of ideas. And although we don't talk about BDS anymore, those ideas are still out there. People are still picking them up fresh. There are NGOs that do a lot of things. There are trusts and foundations that are only now getting on this bandwagon. There's the humanitarian sector, if any of you know about the humanitarian sector, has woken up in the last 2 years to the importance of markets in a way which is just extraordinary. So I think it's worth, I think it's worth remembering that what we're doing is kind of planting seeds. We're creating a pathway, we're planting seeds, and people will pick up on that. Even if we as individuals move on into to the next paradigm, other people will still be picking up those seeds. The capacity that we're building now with local organizations, whether they're consultancy companies or contractors or NGOs, that will stay there, and it will leave a legacy. So I'm very optimistic and positive that what we're doing has a lot of value, and I hope that you'll realize that what matters is we leave behind the documentation, the evidence, and the skills and the competencies to sustain this way of thinking, because I think it's very important. That's it. Thank you very much. That's the end of this session. It's not quite the end of the conference. There's just one last thing I want to do, which is I want to introduce my colleague Jack Newnham, who's been my kind of backstop at PwC for the last 2 years, or longer in fact. PwC, as you know, is the prime contractor for the Beam Exchange, and Jack has kind of been there behind the scenes to kind of help me along and create the team and support us in what we're doing, and he's going to say a final word.
Thanks very much, Mike. I'm going to be super brief, and I've got really one thing to say, which is thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your participation. Thank you for your energy, insight, and persistence, I think. I'm looking around the room, and I don't think I've ever been in the final phase of a 2-day conference and seen so many chairs full. So, either we've locked you in, I don't know what, or there's a bit of endurance amongst the group. I've learned a lot, and I'm reflecting on a lot, and I'm going to continue to reflect on what I've learned over the last couple of days. And I'm going to take it home with me to all the other things that I do around work with donors. I've got a thought to leave you with. I've sort of toyed with, how controversial I should be, and I've decided not to be too controversial. But I think this group is incredibly relevant to the broader development community. There are loads of development initiatives, particularly those around economic development in its broader sense, that could learn a lot from everything that's been talked about over the last 2 days. I've got an example that's close to home for me. I'm team leader on the Impact Investment Programme with DFID, which is all about building the market for impact investing. So in a sense, it's right in this space, but slightly bizarrely, it doesn't reference itself as a market systems program or a market, it's all about building the market. It's reassuring, though, because my client at DFID internalizes many of the systemic thinking that I've heard through the last couple of days. So in a sense, he would go, yeah, to everything that's been talked about, but he would also benefit a lot, and we would all, as a team, benefit a lot more from being better engaged with this group and this agenda and this approach. That's the thought to leave you with. Being sort of maybe slightly controversial, the onus is on us, on you, on everyone to be more accessible to the wider market, to the broader development community. I think it's happening, and some of the things that were said, I'm sort of reassured in terms of some of the wrap-up thoughts that, in a sense, the underlying concepts will endure, and the underlying concepts are what is relevant to everybody. But maybe we need to be a little bit more accessible, use a bit of jargon, but this is going to continue to drive better development for years to come, is my sort of thought to leave you with, even if some of the naming of paradigms may change. The underlying concepts are fundamentally right. So you're all right, basically. Finally, I just feel I need to end by thanking the team. Mike, Bushra, Kerry, and Lucio. I'm going to leave people out, but I think the team's worked really hard for this. So I just like to maybe we could all join by just ending with a rousing thanks to the Beam team. Thanks very much.